The mountains of northern Afghanistan held their breath under a moonless sky in October 2004 as Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale led his reconnaissance team through terrain that had swallowed armies for centuries. The Rangers had been deployed to sweep the border regions where intelligence suggested a high-value target might be moving weapons caches across ancient shepherd trails. But 3 days into their patrol, they had found nothing except abandoned stone corrals and the skeletal remains of Soviet-era encampments that littered the valleys like the bones of forgotten giants. The air at this altitude cut through their thermal layers with a cold that seemed to carry memory, and every step forward felt like walking deeper into a silence that predated nations and flags. Their mission brief had been straightforward: locate, observe, report. But the mountains had a way of making straightforward missions complicated, and by the third night, Hale could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against the edges of their operation. Private First Class Tommy Chen was the first to spot the anomaly through his night vision scope just after 0200 hours. A lone figure moving with deliberate slowness across a ridgeline 2 clicks to their northeast, guiding what appeared to be a small flock of sheep through passages that military maps designated as impassable for livestock. The thermal signature was clean, human, adult male. But the pattern of movement struck Chen as wrong in a way he struggled to articulate over the radio. The shepherd walked with a rhythm that seemed choreographed, stopping at precise intervals, backtracking over his own path, creating loops and overlapping tracks that formed no logical grazing pattern. Hale pulled his team into a covered position among the rocks and glassed the figure himself, watching as the distant silhouette performed what looked almost like a dance, deliberately complicating the trail he left behind. Something in the shepherd's movements triggered an instinct honed through 2 previous deployments, the recognition that this was not random wandering, but communication, a message written in the language of footprints for someone who knew how to read them. The decision to track the shepherd, rather than continue their original patrol route, came with professional risk that Hale calculated in the seconds it took his team to regroup. Deviating from mission parameters required justification, and a suspicious shepherd was not technically within their operational mandate. But years of combat had taught him to trust the itch between his shoulder blades that said something significant was unfolding, and the elaborate trail pattern the shepherd was laying down screamed significance. He radioed their position to command with a carefully worded request to pursue a potential intelligence opportunity, knowing that in the gaps between words and clearance protocols, his team was already moving. They descended from their observation point, using a route that would bring them to the shepherd's trail without exposing their position, each ranger moving with the fluid silence that came from hundreds of hours training in the kill houses back at Fort Benning. The rocks here were loose shale that clicked and slid underfoot, and they navigated the descent with a patience that turned minutes into geological time, every movement calculated against the risk of sound carrying across the empty valleys. When they reached the trail system the shepherd had created, Hale knelt to examine the tracks under the filtered red glow of his flashlight. The prints were fresh, deep enough to show the weight distribution of someone carrying extra load, and scattered among them were the cloven marks of the sheep moving in patterns that made no grazing sense whatsoever. But woven through this surface story was something else entirely. Every 20 meters, one particular sheep, identifiable by a distinctive drag in its rear left hoof, had been deliberately stopped and repositioned to create a secondary pattern. Chen, who had grown up on a ranch in Montana before enlisting, crouched beside Hale and traced the pattern with his finger, recognizing what the others had missed. This was not a shepherd managing a flock, but someone using animals as a printing press, stamping coordinates into the earth. The drag-hoof sheep had been placed at specific points that, when connected, formed vectors pointing toward a draw 3 clicks southeast, a location that did not appear on any of their tactical maps as significant. Hale felt the mission shift beneath him, like tectonic plates finding new alignment, understanding that they were no longer hunters, but interpreters, reading a message that someone had risked everything to write. The team moved along the trail with renewed purpose as first light began to gray the eastern peaks, following the encoded directions that led them away from their planned extraction point and deeper into terrain that swallowed radio signals and GPS reliability. After 90 minutes of careful pursuit, they crested a ridge and found themselves looking down into a narrow valley that appeared on their maps as empty wilderness, but now revealed signs of recent human presence, disturbed scree, broken vegetation, and most significantly, the scattered remains of emergency rations and medical packaging that bore U.S. military markings. Sergeant First Class Maria Delgado, the team's medic and tracking specialist, moved forward to examine the debris field, her practiced eye cataloging details that told a story of desperation and survival. The medical wrappings were for field treatment of blast injuries. The ration packages had been opened with the efficient tears of trained soldiers rather than the ragged rips of civilians. And the whole site was perhaps 4 days old, matching exactly the timeline of when a Marine reconnaissance unit had missed 2 consecutive check-in windows from a position 40 clicks north. Hale pulled out his satellite communicator and tried to raise command, but the valley walls killed the signal, leaving them alone with the growing certainty that the Shepherd had not been leaving a trail for insurgents but for them, marking the path to men who needed finding before the mountains claimed them permanently. The discovery of American military debris transformed their reconnaissance mission into a combat search and rescue operation that existed in the gray zone between official orders and moral imperative. Hale gathered his 4-man team in the shadow of an outcropping that provided both cover and a vantage point over the valley floor, and they conducted what soldiers call a hasty assessment, weighing known facts against operational risk with the kind of speed that looks like intuition but is actually compressed experience. The missing Marine unit, call sign Reaper 26, had been conducting surveillance on suspected weapons routes when their last communication reported technical difficulties and possible compromise by local forces. Standard protocol after missed check-ins involved search grids and air assets, but the weather had turned violent the day after Reaper 26 went silent, grounding helicopters and turning the mountains into a maze where conventional search patterns became exercises in futility. The Shepherd's trail suggested that someone on the ground knew exactly where the lost unit had gone to Earth and was trying to guide rescuers to them using the only communication method that would survive in terrain where radios failed and satellites could not penetrate. Chen volunteered to scout ahead while the rest of the team established a secure position, his ranching background making him the best qualified to identify and follow the livestock trail markers that continued deeper into the valley. He moved with the careful speed of someone who understood that mountains killed the hasty and the hesitant with equal efficiency. Reading the landscape for both the Shepherd signs and the tactical threats that could turn a rescue into an ambush, the trail led him through a series of switchbacks that descended into increasingly narrow passages, where the walls closed overhead in places, creating natural tunnels that amplified sound and turned visibility into a series of abbreviated glimpses. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, he found the next marker, a rock cairn that was too deliberately placed to be natural, with 3 stones stacked in a configuration that pointed unmistakably toward a cliff face that appeared to dead-end the valley. He radioed back his position using the team's short-range burst transmitters, describing what he had found and requesting permission to investigate the apparent terminus of the trail. Hale brought the full team forward to Chen's position, and together they approached the cliff face with the tactical discipline that had been drilled into them until it became autonomic. What had appeared from a distance to be solid rock revealed itself on closer inspection to be a cleverly concealed opening, a natural cave system whose entrance was hidden behind a fall of boulders that looked like random scree but had been carefully arranged to create both concealment and a defensive position. The arrangement bore the fingerprints of military training, the kind of field-expedient fortification that Rangers and Recon Marines learned in the same survival schools, and Hale felt a surge of certainty that they were on the right track. Delgado moved to the entrance and conducted a careful visual sweep using her scope, looking for tripwires or booby traps that could indicate either a defended position or an enemy ambush, but the approaches were clean. She signaled the all clear, and the team prepared to make entry using their standard clearing procedures, knowing that what waited inside could be anything from wounded friendlies to hostile forces who had found the cave first. The interior of the cave system opened into a chamber large enough to provide shelter for a small unit, and the evidence of recent occupation was immediate and unmistakable. Combat gear lay organized along one wall, the kind of careful arrangement that spoke of discipline maintained even under duress. Empty ammunition boxes were stacked with their labels facing outward for easy inventory. Medical supplies were sorted by type and urgency, and in the center of the space, someone had created a makeshift command post, using rocks to weight down maps and communication equipment that had clearly failed. But the chamber was empty of personnel, and the freshness of the tracks leading deeper into the cave system indicated that whoever had sheltered here had moved recently, either advancing further into the mountain or retreating from a threat that had discovered their position. Hale examined the maps and recognized the plotting symbols of Marine reconnaissance teams, confirming that they had found Reaper 26's emergency cache, but the absence of the Marines themselves created a new and more urgent mystery. The tracks leading deeper into the cave were chaotic, lacking the organized pattern of a tactical withdrawal and suggesting instead a hasty retreat under pressure. Delgado identified at least 6 distinct boot prints, indicating that most or all of Reaper 26 had survived whatever had sent them underground, but the presence of blood spots on the cave floor told a darker story about the condition they were in. The team pushed forward into the narrowing passages, with weapons ready and night vision engaged, each step taking them deeper into a darkness that their equipment could barely penetrate. The cave system branched and twisted with a geometry that seemed designed to disorient, and they marked their path with chemical light sticks to ensure they could find their way back to the entrance. After 30 meters of careful progression, they heard it, the sound of movement ahead, rhythmic and deliberate, followed by a voice speaking in English with the hoarse quality of someone who had been silent too long. Hale called out the challenge phrase from their unit's current authentication codes, and after a pause that stretched across heartbeats, the correct response came back, delivered in a tone that carried equal parts relief and residual combat tension. Corporal James Wade of Reaper 26 emerged from the shadows of the deeper cave with his rifle lowered, but not quite slung, his face carrying the gaunt look of someone who had been operating on the edge of sustainability for days. Behind him came the rest of his team, 5 Marines in various states of exhaustion and injury, their uniforms torn and stained with the kind of dirt that came from living underground, their eyes adjusting slowly to the filtered light of the Rangers' flashlights. Wade identified himself and his unit with the clipped precision of a man who had held his team together through situations that would have broken lesser leaders. And when he spoke, his voice carried the texture of gravel and determination in equal measure. They had been compromised during their surveillance operation when a sudden rockfall, possibly triggered by mortar fire from a distant engagement, had destroyed their primary extraction point and damaged their communications equipment beyond field repair. With hostile forces known to be operating in the area and no way to call for support, Wade had made the decision to go to ground in the cave system, gambling that search and rescue would eventually vector into their area if they could survive long enough to be found. The injuries among Reaper 26 ranged from serious to manageable, and Delgado moved immediately into triage mode, her medic training taking priority over the tactical situation as she assessed each Marine with the swift competence that came from treating combat casualties in worse conditions than this cave offered. Lance Corporal Rodriguez had taken shrapnel to his left leg when the rockfall hit, and while Wade had managed to stabilize the bleeding using their organic medical supplies, the wound was showing early signs of infection that required antibiotics they no longer possessed. Private First Class Martin had suffered a concussion from a blow that had knocked him unconscious for several minutes, and his symptoms of nausea and light sensitivity suggested he needed evaluation beyond what field medicine could provide. The remaining 3 Marines were mobile and combat effective, but operating on reduced rations and the kind of fatigue that accumulated interest, like a loan that would eventually demand payment. Delgado worked through her assessment with practiced efficiency, while Hale and Wade conducted a tactical consultation, comparing notes on enemy activity in the area and planning the extraction that would have to move 7 additional personnel through terrain that barely supported their original 4-man team. The shepherd, who had laid the trail that led the Rangers to this cave, had not revealed himself, And Wade explained that their contact with the Afghan local had been brief and conducted entirely through gestures and the kind of improvised communication that emerged when language failed but necessity remained. The shepherd had appeared at the cave entrance on their second day underground, approaching with a caution that suggested he understood the dangers of startling armed men in desperate situations, and he had somehow communicated through signs and drawn diagrams that he would mark a trail that American forces could follow. Wade had no way to confirm that the message had been received or that the shepherd would follow through, but the alternative was to wait in the cave until their supplies ran out or hostile forces conducted a systematic search that would eventually find them. The shepherd had asked for nothing in return, accepting neither payment nor promises, and had disappeared back into the mountains with his flock before Wade could fully process what had transpired. The old man's motivation remained opaque, perhaps gratitude for some past American action, perhaps opposition to the forces that controlled the region, or perhaps simply the mountain ethics that said, "You help people who are lost, regardless of which flag they serve." Hale's immediate problem was logistics rendered in the brutal mathematics of distance, injury, and threat. They were approximately 8 clicks from the nearest extraction point that could accommodate a helicopter, and the route required traversing exposed ridgelines where they would be visible to anyone scanning the terrain. Rodriguez could not walk unassisted with his leg injury, which meant they would need to improvise a carry system using their tactical gear, and Martin's concussion meant he could not be relied upon for fighting strength if they made contact with hostile forces. The Rangers had brought supplies calculated for 4 men on a 3-day reconnaissance patrol, and stretching those resources to support 11 personnel over an extraction timeline that would certainly extend beyond a single day required the kind of creative rationing that turned meals into gestures and water into currency. He made the decision to split his team's capabilities, leaving Chen and Specialist Jake Morrison with the Marines to establish security and begin preparing Rodriguez for transport, while he and Delgado moved back to the cave entrance to attempt communication with command and request emergency extraction with full medical support. The climb back through the cave system to the entrance took 15 minutes that Hale used to mentally compose the situation report he would need to deliver, knowing that the successful location of Reaper 2-6 would trigger a cascade of responses from multiple command levels, each with their own priorities and timelines. When they reached the entrance and emerged into daylight that had progressed to mid-morning, he positioned himself in the most advantageous spot for satellite line of sight and powered up the communications rig, cycling through frequencies until he achieved a connection weak enough to require multiple transmission attempts, but strong enough to convey the essential facts. The voice that responded from the Tactical Operations Center carried the controlled urgency of someone who had been managing a search operation that had just shifted from theoretical to immediate, and Hale delivered his report in the standard format that compressed complex situations into digestible information blocks. He provided coordinates, casualty status, threat assessment, and extraction requirements, speaking in the verbal shorthand that military radio communication had evolved over decades of needing to say much with few words. The response came back with the confirmation he needed. Helicopters were spinning up, medical teams were being briefed, and fire support assets were being repositioned to provide overwatch for an extraction scheduled to commence as soon as tactical conditions allowed. The 12 hours between establishing communication with command and the arrival of extraction helicopters stretched across a timeline that moved with the elastic quality of combat waiting, where minutes could feel like hours and hours could collapse into moments. Hale returned to the deeper cave, where his team and the Marines had established a defensive perimeter that turned the natural choke points of the cave system into a tactical advantage, positioning their limited firepower to maximize the cost of any attempt to assault their position. Wade had organized his Marines with the efficiency of someone who had learned leadership through application rather than theory, assigning sectors of responsibility and establishing rest rotations that ensured continuous security despite their reduced numbers and degraded physical condition. The two teams merged into a single operational unit with the seamless integration that came from shared training pipelines and common operational culture. Rangers and Marines, setting aside their traditional inter-service rivalry, in favor of the practical cooperation that survival demanded. They shared rations with the careful equality of men who understood that fairness mattered more than hunger, and they talked in the low voices of people killing time while remaining alert to threats that could materialize without warning. Rodriguez's condition became the focus of Delgado's medical attention as she worked to stabilize his leg injury using the combined resources of both teams' medical kits, her hands moving with the practiced confidence of someone who had treated worse wounds in worse conditions. The shrapnel had created a wound channel that was deeper than Wade's initial field treatment had been able to fully address, and she cleaned and repacked the injury using techniques that made Rodriguez grip his rifle to manage pain that their limited supply of morphine could only partially address. She started him on a course of broad-spectrum antibiotics from her kit, calculating doses that would bridge the gap until proper surgical intervention could occur, and she elevated and wrapped the leg to reduce swelling that threatened to compromise circulation. While she worked, she talked to Rodriguez in the steady stream of conversation that medics use to distract casualties from their injuries, asking about his family and his plans for after deployment, building a narrative of future that created psychological distance from present pain. The other Marines watched this process with the quiet attention of men who understood they might need similar treatment before the mission concluded, and the competence Delgado displayed became a source of confidence that extended beyond her immediate patient. Chen used the waiting time to conduct a detailed reconnaissance of the cave entrance area, mapping the approaches and identifying positions that would provide early warning if hostile forces attempted to locate or assault their position. He found evidence that the shepherd had returned at least once more, fresh sheep tracks that circled the boulder field concealing the entrance, and he interpreted this as either reconnaissance to confirm that his trail had been followed or protective overwatch to ensure that other parties did not discover the cave. The mountains around them remained quiet throughout the morning, showing no signs of the enemy activity that intelligence had suggested saturated the region, and this absence of threat became its own source of tension as the teams waited for contact that military experience suggested should have occurred. Morrison established an observation post on a slight rise that provided sight lines over the approach valleys, using natural camouflage to create a hide position from which he could monitor movement without exposing their location, and he maintained watch in 2-hour rotations with Chen that provided continuous surveillance, while allowing each man recovery time. The afternoon brought a shift in weather that rolled down from the higher peaks in the form of clouds that dropped the ceiling and reduced visibility to less than a kilometer, creating conditions that complicated the planned helicopter extraction. Hale monitored the tactical frequency and listened as the operation coordinator walked him through the decision tree that was unfolding at command, where pilots and planners were calculating risk against necessity and weighing the danger of flying in marginal weather against the medical urgency of Rodriguez's condition and the tactical vulnerability of 11 men in a cave with limited supplies. The conversation occurred in the abbreviated codes and tactical terminology that allowed complex discussions to occur over insecure radio channels, and Hale found himself simultaneously advocating for immediate extraction while acknowledging the legitimate safety concerns that grounded aircraft in conditions where visibility and rotor clearance became lethal uncertainties. The final decision came down from a level of command authority that Hale never directly interfaced with, delivered through the chain with the weight of calculated risk. Extraction would proceed as planned, using a flight profile that prioritized safety margins while accepting that marginal weather added danger to an operation already classified as high risk. The sound of approaching helicopters reached them first as a distant percussion that grew steadily until it filled the valley with mechanical thunder, the distinctive beat of rotor blades chopping air in a rhythm that every soldier recognized as the sound of salvation arriving. 2 Blackhawks came in fast and low, using the terrain to mask their approach until the last possible moment, their pilots flying with the aggressive confidence that came from thousands of hours turning helicopters into instruments of tactical ballet. They established a landing zone in the largest relatively flat area within a kilometer of the cave, their crews deploying to establish security while their rotors continued to turn, knowing that time on the ground measured opportunity for enemy engagement. Hale's team and the Marines moved out of the cave in a tactical column, with Rodriguez carried on an improvised litter that Morrison and one of the Marines had constructed from equipment straps and tent poles, the movement controlled and deliberate, despite the urgency everyone felt to reach the helicopters, before the weather closed completely or hostile forces reacted to the obvious presence of American aircraft. They covered the 800 meters to the landing zone in less than 15 minutes, moving through terrain that tried to break ankles and deny purchase with every step, until they reached the relative sanctuary of the helicopter's cargo area and felt the aircraft lift with a power that represented technological superiority over geography. The flight back to forward operating base Salerno compressed the mountains into a passing panorama, visible through the Black Hawk's open doors, the landscape below transforming from immediate threat into abstract geography, as altitude provided both safety and perspective. Rodriguez received advanced medical attention from the flight medic who had accompanied the extraction, a Navy corpsman whose calm efficiency suggested he had seen worse cases survive through the combination of quick treatment and the golden hour that helicopter evacuation provided to modern combat casualties. The rest of Reaper 26 sat in the vibrating interior of the aircraft with the 1,000-yard stare that came from transitioning out of survival mode, their bodies present in the helicopter, but their minds still processing the days underground and the proximity to outcomes that would have been much darker without the Shepherd's intervention. Wade sat across from Hale, and the two team leaders exchanged the kind of look that required no words, professional respect passing between men who had done difficult jobs in difficult circumstances and brought everyone home. The second Black Hawk carried Chen, Morrison, and the remaining Marines, flying in tactical formation that provided mutual support and overlapping fields of fire should ground threats materialize, but the flight proceeded without incident through weather that remained marginal but navigable. The base received them with the organized chaos of a military installation processing an emergency medical situation, with ambulances positioned at the helicopter landing pad and medical personnel ready to move Rodriguez directly to the surgical suite, where a team was already scrubbed and prepared to address his wound with capabilities that vastly exceeded anything possible in the field. Martin went to the same facility for evaluation of his concussion, accompanied by Delgado, who provided continuity of care and a detailed handoff to the physicians who would take over his treatment. The rest of the combined team went through the standard procedures of operational debriefing, surrendering weapons to the armory, accounting for equipment and ammunition, and providing initial verbal reports to the intelligence staff who needed to understand what they had seen and done, before memories began the natural process of degradation and reconstruction. Hale found himself in a small office with a major from the operations staff who took notes while he walked through the timeline, from first observation of the Shepherd through the cave discovery to the successful extraction, and he tried to convey the significance of the trail markings and the mysterious Afghan who had made the rescue possible. The question of the Shepherd's identity and location became a priority for the intelligence section, which recognized that someone who had demonstrated both knowledge of American units in trouble and willingness to assist represented either a valuable asset or a sophisticated deception that required investigation. They tasked aerial reconnaissance to survey the area where the Shepherd had been operating, looking for encampments or villages that might provide leads on his identity, and they reached out to their networks of local contacts to gather information about Shepherds known to move through those particular valleys during this season. The effort produced limited results, as the region was remote enough that detailed intelligence on individual civilians was sparse, and the transient nature of pastoral herding meant that tracking a specific shepherd was like trying to identify a specific wave in an ocean. What they did discover was that the area had historical significance as a route used by Mujahideen fighters during the Soviet occupation, and that several of the older generation who had fought in that conflict still maintained connections to the mountains and to the trails that armies had traveled for centuries. Hale spent the evening writing his formal after-action report, translating the events of the patrol into the structured format that military documentation required, trying to capture in bureaucratic language the sequence of decisions and observations that had led them to Reaper 26. He found himself struggling to articulate the intuition that had driven him to pursue the shepherd rather than continue their original mission, knowing that the report would be read by people who would evaluate his decision-making through the lens of regulations and procedures that could not account for the instincts that experienced soldiers developed. He wrote carefully about the trail markings and the deliberate patterns that Chen had identified, providing enough detail to justify the deviation from mission parameters while omitting the more subjective elements of the decision process. When he finished and submitted the report through the system, he felt the peculiar exhaustion that came not from physical exertion, but from the mental effort of transforming experience into narrative, of making the chaotic and intuitive fit into formats designed for clarity and accountability. The next morning brought a summons to the office of Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, the battalion commander whose authority encompassed all ranger operations in the sector, and Hale reported with the mild apprehension that all sergeants felt when called before senior officers outside the normal chain of routine. Brennan was a career officer who had come up through special operations and carried himself with the lean intensity of someone who still trained, like he might have to lead from the front, and he received Hale with a directness that bypassed pleasantries in favor of substance. He had read Hale's report and had received additional information from the Marine chain of command about Reaper 26's rescue, and he wanted to discuss the broader implications of what had occurred. The shepherd's intervention represented a break in the pattern of civilian behavior, in a region where American forces typically received either passive non-cooperation or active hostility, and understanding what had motivated this particular individual to act could provide insights into the complex human terrain that ultimately determined success or failure in counterinsurgency operations. Brennan asked questions that probed beyond the facts of the report, trying to understand the nuances of the encounter and the possibilities it represented for future engagement with local populations. The conversation with Brennan evolved from debriefing into strategic discussion, as the colonel shared intelligence assessments that placed the shepherd's actions within a larger context of tribal dynamics and generational memory that shaped behavior in ways that operational planning often failed to anticipate. The region where the shepherd had operated sat at the intersection of multiple tribal territories, and the families who had lived there for generations maintained complex relationships with outside forces based on decades of experience with Soviets, Taliban, Northern Alliance fighters, and now American and coalition troops. Some of the older men had fought alongside CIA-supported Mujahideen in the 1980s, receiving training and weapons from Americans who had seen them as allies against Soviet expansion, and those historical connections created threads of relationship that occasionally manifested in unexpected ways. The intelligence staff had managed to identify a possible candidate for the shepherd through a combination of aerial surveillance and human intelligence gathered from village contacts. An older man named Daoud Khan had been observed moving sheep through the valleys in question during the relevant time frame, and local sources reported that he had fought with Massoud's forces during the Soviet occupation before returning to pastoral life. Khan had a reputation as someone who maintained traditional codes of honor and who held complicated views about the various armed groups that competed for control of Afghanistan. The mission to find Khan fell to Hale's team, along with a civil affairs specialist and an interpreter, launching as a dismounted patrol into the same mountains 2 weeks after the rescue. They moved through valleys, transforming with early winter, following intelligence leads to seasonal encampments where families lived in tents and stone shelters. They inquired carefully at each location, building a trail of information that led them deeper into high country, where fewer people ventured as winter approached. On the 4th day, they encountered an old woman who confirmed that Khan had been in the area recently and could be found in a valley requiring another day's travel. Captain Lisa Warren negotiated the interaction with patients, offering tea and sugar while gathering information. They camped that night and discussed how to approach Khan when they found him, knowing the contact needed to communicate respect and gratitude without creating complications for a man who had maintained careful neutrality. They found Daoud Khan the next afternoon in a valley that opened around a clear stream, his flock spread across slopes where late-season grass provided final grazing before winter. He was an old man whose weathered face mapped decades of mountain weather, and whose eyes carried the alertness of people who had survived multiple wars. Khan watched their approach without alarm, sitting with his staff and dog, and he waited until they were close before standing to receive them with formal courtesy. Warren handled the greetings through the interpreter, gradually steering conversation toward the events that had brought them to seek him out. Khan listened to Warren's explanation, with the stillness of people who had learned to reveal nothing through expression, his eyes moving from her face to Hale and the other rangers with thorough assessment. When she finished and the interpreter completed translation, Khan remained silent for a time that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable for the Americans. Finally, Khan spoke in Pashto with rhythmic cadence, and the interpreter translated in segments. Khan acknowledged that he had found the Marines in their cave and had recognized them as American soldiers who were lost and in danger, confirming that he had deliberately created a trail pattern designed to guide other American forces to their location using techniques learned during the Soviet War. His motivation for helping came from factors that Western planning might categorize as tactical, but which he understood as moral obligations transcending current conflict politics. During the Soviet occupation, he had received assistance from Americans who supplied weapons and training to the Mujahideen, and while he held complicated feelings about how that support ended, he maintained a sense of debt to Americans who had stood with Afghans against invasion. More immediately, he had observed the Marines conducting themselves with discipline before they went missing, noting they had not harassed local shepherds or damaged property, or shown the casual arrogance he associated with soldiers who saw Afghanistan as battlefield rather than someone's home. The specific decision to help rather than simply observe came during his second day of watching the cave entrance, when he had seen one of the Marines emerge briefly to refill water containers from a nearby spring, and had recognized in the Marines' careful movements the desperation of men running out of options. Khan had fought long enough to know what trapped soldiers looked like regardless of uniform, and his own memories of being cut off from support during Soviet operations had created empathy that transcended the nominal oppositions of the current war. He had returned to his seasonal camp and spent an evening considering whether to act, knowing that helping Americans could create complications with other groups operating in the mountains. But ultimately, his sense of obligation and his reading of these particular soldiers as worthy of assistance had driven him to create the trail. Warren thanked Khan on behalf of the American command and offered compensation that she had been authorized to provide. But Khan declined, with the firm courtesy of someone who considered payment an insult to actions taken from honor rather than commerce. He did accept a letter of appreciation written in both English and Pashto that documented his assistance and could potentially provide protection if he ever needed to prove his relationship with American forces, and he listened carefully as Warren explained through the interpreter that the letter could be presented at any American checkpoint or base if he required help in the future. The conversation wound down through the elaborate courtesies that Afghan culture required for leave-taking, and the patrol prepared to begin their return journey with the satisfied feeling of a mission completed and a debt properly acknowledged. Before they left, Khan spoke again, and the interpreter translated words that carried weight beyond their simple content. Khan said that mountains held many secrets, and that soldiers who learned to read what mountains showed them would survive longer than those who relied only on technology and weapons. He indicated that the old ways of communication through trail signs and natural markers had served fighters for centuries before radios existed and would continue to serve long after modern equipment failed. The statement carried implicit offer of future assistance, wrapped in enough ambiguity to maintain Khan's careful neutrality, and Hale understood that they had gained not just information about one rescue, but potentially an ally whose knowledge of terrain and local conditions could prove valuable in future operations. The return to base marked the conclusion of active operations, but opened a period of reflection and analysis that extended through the winter months as various levels of command processed the implications of what had occurred. Hale's team returned to their regular operational tempo, conducting patrols and missions that became part of the accumulated experience of deployment. But the Shepherd incident remained a reference point that commanders cited in briefings about effective engagement with local populations. The rescue of Reaper 26 became a minor legend within the special operations community, told and retold with the variations that oral tradition introduced. And the role of the Afghan shepherd, who had bridged the gap between desperate Marines and searching Rangers, took on symbolic significance that exceeded the specific tactical details. Rodriguez recovered fully from his leg wound after surgery at the military hospital in Germany and eventual return to duty, and he maintained contact with Hale through the informal networks that connected soldiers who had shared significant experiences. Martin's concussion resolved without lasting complications, and the rest of Reaper 2-6 completed their deployment and rotated home with stories that they would carry for the rest of their lives. Wade received a commendation for his leadership in keeping his team alive during the days underground, and the Marine Corps incorporated the incident into training scenarios that taught junior leaders about decision-making under isolation and resource constraint. The intelligence section continued monitoring the region where Khan operated his seasonal herding, and over subsequent months they documented several instances where trail markers appeared that seemed designed to convey information to American patrols about hostile movement or weapons caches. The markers were never conclusive enough to act upon alone, but they provided starting points for investigations that occasionally yielded results. And analysts came to recognize Khan's distinctive patterns in the way stones were stacked or vegetation was disturbed. Whether Khan was actively choosing to help or simply moving through mountains in ways that Americans had learned to interpret remained ambiguous, but the practical effect was the same, a flow of ground-level intelligence that no technical system could replicate. Captain Warren wrote a detailed report about her interaction with Khan that became part of the growing body of civil affairs doctrine about working with local populations in complex cultural environments. She emphasized that Khan's assistance had come not from monetary incentive or political alignment, but from personal honor codes and historical memory that connected present actions to past relationships spanning decades. Her recommendation was that military engagement needed to account for these long-term relationship dynamics and recognize that actions taken today created debts and obligations that might not manifest until years later when different soldiers faced different crises in the same mountains. The broader lesson that emerged from analysis of the incident was that technology and firepower, while essential to modern military operations, could not substitute for human relationships and cultural understanding when operations required navigation through human terrain as complex as physical geography. Reaper 2-6 had been found not through satellite surveillance or signals intelligence, but through an old man with sheep who had chosen to help because soldiers decades earlier had earned trust that persisted across generational and political change. The rescue demonstrated that counterinsurgency success required building networks of relationship and reputation that operated on timescales longer than deployment rotations, and that individual acts of respect or assistance could generate returns that appeared unexpectedly when they were most needed. Years after the incident, Hale found himself assigned to a training role at Fort Benning, where he taught land navigation and small unit tactics to new ranger candidates, and he incorporated the shepherd story into lessons about terrain analysis and human intelligence. He would walk students through the decision process of following the suspicious trail patterns and explain how Chen's ranching background had provided the key insight about the deliberately positioned sheep. The story became a teaching tool about the importance of diverse experience within teams and about trusting intuition that came from pattern recognition developed through years of fieldwork. He emphasized that the technology they carried was powerful, but not infallible, and that sometimes the most important intelligence came from reading landscape and behavior rather than from screens and sensors. Chen left active duty after his enlistment ended and returned to Montana, where he took over the family ranch, bringing military discipline to the management of livestock and land that his grandfather had homesteaded 3 generations earlier. He stayed in touch with Hale through occasional emails and holiday cards, and once when Hale was passing through the region on leave, they spent an afternoon drinking beer and remembering the mountains of Afghanistan. Chen admitted that he sometimes wondered about Khan, and whether the old shepherd was still moving his flocks through those valleys, or whether age or war had finally claimed him. The wondering was part of how soldiers processed experiences that had shaped them, trying to maintain connection to moments that felt significant, even as time and distance attenuated the details into stories polished smooth by retelling. Morrison pursued a career in military intelligence after the deployment, specializing in human terrain analysis and cultural understanding, and he cited the Shepard incident in his application essays as the experience that had redirected his professional interests. He recognized that the most sophisticated technical intelligence in the world had failed to locate Reaper 26, while an illiterate shepherd using nothing but sheep and stones had succeeded, and he wanted to understand how to systematically incorporate that kind of ground-level cultural knowledge into intelligence processes. His work contributed to doctrine development about integrating local knowledge networks into military planning, and he eventually found himself briefing senior leaders about the persistent importance of human relationships in achieving strategic objectives. Delgado completed multiple deployments as a Ranger medic before transitioning to a position training other medics, and she brought to her teaching the hard-won knowledge of what worked and what failed when treating casualties in austere environments. She used Rodriguez's case as an example of how proper field treatment could stabilize critical injuries long enough for evacuation to work. And she emphasized that technical medical skills mattered less than calm decision-making and the ability to improvise when standard procedures or equipment were not available. Her students learned that being a good medic meant being part doctor, part mechanic, and part psychologist, treating bodies and minds with equal attention to the reality that injured soldiers needed both physical care and mental confidence that they would survive. The shepherd himself, Daoud Khan, remained in the mountains as seasons cycled through their ancient rhythms, and Afghanistan continued its complicated relationship with outside forces seeking to shape its future. Whether he knew that his actions had become teaching stories in American military schools, or that analysts continued to watch for his trail markers, was unclear and perhaps irrelevant. He had done what his understanding of honor required in a specific moment when lost soldiers needed guidance. And having done so, he had returned to the life of moving sheep through high country and lower valleys, according to patterns older than nations. His intervention had saved lives and created ripples that extended far beyond what he could see or know, proving that individual choices made according to personal codes of conduct could alter outcomes in ways that grand strategies and military might sometimes could not. The decade following the rescue saw continued American military presence in Afghanistan, with varying levels of intensity and changing strategic objectives, and the mountains where Khan had laid his trail remained contested space, where multiple armed groups competed for control while local populations tried to survive between competing pressures. Some valleys saw development with new roads and infrastructure built through military civil affairs projects, while others remained as remote as they had been for centuries, accessible only to those who knew the trails and could endure the altitude and weather. The war that had brought Rangers and Marines into those mountains eventually wound down through negotiated agreements and strategic reassessments, and American forces withdrew with the mixed feelings that accompanied all such endings, knowing that objectives had been partially achieved while fundamental problems remained unresolved. The lessons learned from the Shepard incident were codified into doctrine and training that outlasted the specific conflict, becoming part of institutional knowledge about the importance of cultural awareness and local engagement in complex operational environments. Military planners recognized that future conflicts would continue to require operations in human terrain, where relationships and reputation mattered as much as firepower and technology, and they worked to create training programs that taught cultural sensitivity alongside tactical skills. The challenge remained how to systematize insights that came from individual experiences, and how to transfer knowledge across deployment rotations when the people who had learned hard lessons moved on to other assignments or left military service entirely. Khan's specific contribution to saving Reaper 26 became one small thread in the larger tapestry of Afghan-American interaction across decades of engagement, a positive story in a landscape that held many darker narratives of misunderstanding and tragedy. The fact that an old Afghan shepherd had helped American soldiers because of relationships built 30 years earlier demonstrated both the possibility of genuine cross-cultural alliance and the reality that such alliances required consistent effort across generations to maintain. The incident suggested that military effectiveness in culturally complex environments depended not just on what current forces did, but on accumulated reputation built through decades of actions both large and small, that created patterns of trust or suspicion that shaped how local populations responded to foreign military presence. For the individuals directly involved, the experience remained a defining moment that they carried forward into whatever came after military service, a story that illustrated principles they tried to apply in civilian contexts where the stakes were different, but human dynamics remained familiar. Hale teaching land navigation to new rangers, Chen managing his ranch, Morrison analyzing intelligence, Delgado training medics, Wade leading Marines, Rodriguez recovering and returning to duty, all of them carried forward the knowledge that survival and success often depended on unlikely connections and unexpected help from people who chose to act according to personal codes that transcended political alignments. They had learned that technology failed, plans changed, missions evolved, but that human judgment and cultural awareness remained constant requirements for anyone operating in complicated environments where simple categories of friend and enemy dissolved into more nuanced realities. The mountains of Afghanistan continued their geological patience, indifferent to human conflicts that appeared and receded like weather patterns crossing their peaks, while the trails that shepherds like Khan followed remained as they had been for centuries, corridors of movement and communication that would serve future travelers regardless of what flags they carried or what causes they served. The story of how an old man with sheep had guided American soldiers to their lost comrades became one more layer of accumulated history that those mountains held, joining countless other stories of helpers and warriors, survivors and casualties, all of whom had learned that mountains kept their secrets until someone who knew how to read them appeared at the right moment to interpret signs that others would walk past without seeing.